Welcome to Pick of the Pods, the podcast. This is the audio companion to the Pick of the Pods newsletter, which delivers you a weekly recommendation of the one podcast you should be listening to right now. I listen to hundreds of podcasts, and only the best make it onto Pick of the Pods. Find dozens of picks on my newsletter on Substack. This podcast goes deeper. I'm talking directly to the people who make some of those great podcasts to find out how they do what they do and to hear about what they're listening to. My guest on this episode is Jonathan Block. Hi, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm well, Robin. How are you? It's a joy to be here with you today.
It's great to be speaking to you. We've not met before, but I've enjoyed your podcast, which has a pun in the title. Tell us what it's called.
So the podcast is called Stumbling Blocks, How Great Leaders Are Made. And it's a pun, as you just noted, based on my last name, which is Block. And
what is it? How do you describe it to people?
Yeah, so many podcasts or interviews with great leaders talk about the moments that are wonderful, the rosy moments, the mountaintop moments, which are great and we all need. But this podcast really speaks to those moments maybe in between the mountaintops, the deepest valleys that led to those mountaintop moments. And so that's where the pun comes from, stumbling blocks. I shorten it to sometimes just calling it the stumble, which is to say that all leaders have moments in their lives, it turns out, where they've stumbled or where someone has pulled the rug out from underneath them and has caused a stumble. And in almost every case, they tell me that those moments of stumble are led to the periods of greatest growth in their lives. And so it's a really fascinating opportunity to talk to some of the most interesting people in the world and learn from them about their stumble and what they learned from it.
Why did you land on that? I assume it's not just because of your name and you thought that would be good. There must have been a eureka moment. I really want to ask people about where they failed or when a disaster struck. Yeah,
so I've studied leaders and leadership really for the past 20 years. Really, my whole career has been based around studying leaders and then serving at leaders' right hands, helping develop leaders, which is what my consulting is in now, is leadership development. And in doing so, what I've realized and seen is that it really is these moments of stumble that lead to the greatest growth. And so maybe the story that sort of paints that picture is I was meeting once with a brand new CEO, and I asked her to tell me about moments as she was thinking about her platform as she stepped into the role of CEO of a large Fortune 250 publicly traded company, thinking about her leadership platform. So I asked her to tell me, when did you grow the most? When have you learned the most? And she said, well, it's the moments, it's those times that are the hardest, actually. And that was about 15 years ago, 10 years ago. And it really just got me thinking that maybe there's something to this, that it's not the mountaintop moments where we learn and where others can learn from us. It's actually those places in between that we don't like to talk about so much, where we have the most to learn and the most to share.
Why a podcast then? Why did you, so you've been in management and consulting, right?
Yeah.
Why did you suddenly decide, I'll leap on the podcast bandwagon?
Well, I'm insatiably curious by nature, and I always have been, and studied journalism actually in undergraduate. My undergraduate degree is in journalism, and so this idea of being curious and talking to people, interviewing people is in my bones. And I can remember as a kid, so I grew up in the Midwestern part of the United States, in Missouri, which has marshes, flatlands and marshes. And in the marshes, you can find what we call cattails, which are marshy sort of tubers that have a really tall, brown, fuzzy thing at the top. And they look like the microphones that President George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev used during as the USSR wound down, and then they negotiated nuclear treaties. And I was a little kid, like 6 or 7, and I would watching President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev on TV at these press conferences. And then I would go down to my family marsh and I would cut down cattails and I would hold them as a microphone and pretend that I was interviewing them or one of them. So this is something that's sort of been in my blood really for as long as I can remember.
What age was that?
I was 6 or 7.
Okay.
It was 1992 that the wall fell, I think. No, 89 the wall fell. So I was 6 or 7 or 8. Yeah.
That is adorable. I mean, most kids, if they pretend to have a microphone, they're going to be rock stars, not
Yeah, I wasn't that
either
cool.
presidents or journalists.
Robin, as you'll soon learn about me, I'm just not that cool.
So before we get to hear more about you, let's hear one of the 3 clips I've asked you to bring along so people listening or watching here can understand what stumbling blocks is. What's your first clip?
Yeah. So my first clip is an interview that I did with Sandra, who is the author of the book, The Power of Trust. She's a Harvard Business School professor and right now really is the world's preeminent expert on trust in business. But in this particular clip, she writes about how to apologize. And Robin, you asked a little bit ago about why I launched this podcast, particularly around stumbling blocks. And of course, the answer, as I mentioned, is that so many leaders have had stumbles and have learned from them, and so have I. And so this episode on apologizing, I heard her first talk about apologizing about 5 years ago. And not long thereafter, I had the chance to apologize for a major mistake I made at work where I really hurt a colleague deeply. And I just stepped in it. I made a big mistake and I hurt her. And she's someone that I cared about a lot. And as I really thought about it, I realized at the end of that year, so it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you know what? I can't really end this year without apologizing to her in a true and deep way. And I need to do that meaningfully. And I leaned on Sandra's method of apologies. And as you'll hear in the clip, she talks about say you're sorry, say what you did, say why you did it without defensiveness, just let the person know the context, and then tell them how you're going to make it right. And that model is, it's a great model and a simple one, and one that I teach to my kids now.
Right, well, let's hear this clip.
The big issue in trust is unintended harm, right? And so that's the part that, in a funny way, companies sometimes kind of back away from. It's like, well, we didn't intend for this to happen. So how mad can you get at me for something I didn't intend? And in trust terms, the answer is really a lot. You still did it. It still had these effects. And so when you think about apologizing in that kind of broader sense, intentionality, of course, matters. And there's lots of research that says that when people are discovered or presumed to have bad intentions, people judge them even more harshly, of course, than they would someone whose intentions they think are pretty benign. But when it comes to betraying someone's trust, I really don't care whether you intended to do it or not. You still did it, right? And that's kind of the big thing. And so for companies, again, that's sometimes a hard Rubicon to cross because now we're in the land of unintended consequences. And all kinds of things happen in corporations all the time that we don't intend, but sort of saying, this is what I'm going to try to fix, that requires a certain commitment to other people's welfare that's at the heart of not betraying trust.
So that was Sandra. She's a professor of management at Harvard Business School and the author of a book called The Power of Trust, talking to my guest, Jonathan Block, on his podcast, Stumbling Blocks. So it's funny, isn't it, Jonathan, when you're making a podcast, I don't know if I like to think of who's going to listen to this, why are they going to listen to it? And, there's lots of different podcasts. Some are just, if you're an Hollywood A-lister or you've been on Saturday Night Live, people are just going to want to hear you speak. You could say anything. You and I are probably not in that category. So I guess in what you're giving people in interviews like that is actual useful guidance. It's like, hey, do you want to know how to apologize? Maybe it's not as simple as you think, these steps. Is that one of the things you're aiming to do with your podcast, to give people actual kind of information they can use?
Yeah, the intent is always, always, always to add value to the listener. And always that they walk away with a couple of tangible ideas that they can apply in their life and leadership right away, that day.
Let's talk a bit about you then. So you did an MBA, a Masters of Business Administration.
That's right.
Why did you do that? What did it give you and what didn't it give you?
Yeah, so early in my career, I'm an eternal optimist. And like I told you a bit ago, a nerd. And I grew up loving politics just from the outset. And so I early in my career, my first job ever, actually out of college, was working in the Bush administration as a political appointee, first for Attorney General Alberto Gonzales. And my interview with him drops later today. So I'll ask your listeners to listen to that. He comments on the scandal that drove him out of office. He and his wife talk about the 5 years afterward that they call the kind of the wilderness, what the faith and the love that led them to what was next. And they also, of course, talk about ICE and Epstein and immigration in America. So it's a great discussion, and their first joint interview since leaving office 19 years ago. But
that's an episode it's not dropped as we talk. It's not yet dropped, right? But it will have done by the time this goes out.
2 hours. That's right.
Okay,
that's
right.
And I share that context. I said, so I worked for him, and then I worked at the White House for Laura Bush. And then I went at the end of 2008. I could begin to see that we thought it was partisan in America at the time, and we had no idea what was coming.
Oh, the innocence!
Right? Oh, the innocence. That's right. We just had no idea what was coming. But you could begin to see, kind of blood in the water. That's the best way I can put it. You could begin to see sort of the fomenting of what is the state of partisanship now. And I just realized that wasn't for me. It's just not how I wanted to invest my life. And so I went into business. I went to Accenture and went into management consulting in the leadership development and change management space, which is where I've been ever since. But a couple of years into my role at Accenture, my boss, a wonderful woman named Cynthia Robin, said, "Jonathan, you're great at value creation and you're great at business development, but you do not know how to run a business." And she was spot on. I didn't know in the red from in the black. And so I took her advice seriously and earned an MBA. And the succinct answer to your question is that it taught me the language of business, and how to speak in terms that my clients could understand versus the way that I understood.
Right. So it wasn't straight after college. It was because you'd started a career and decided there was a hole that needed filling.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I started a career. The career in politics, made a pivot to business, and realized I've got some significant skill gap, and I need to fill it in a substantive way.
Was that a stumbling block for you? If you were a guest on your own show, what would you pick as a stumbling block?
Yeah, no, the stumbling block for me, I think I would say is choosing to leave politics. It is what I had wanted since I was a little boy. And I had thought, I'd grown up thinking I was going to, maybe run for president someday, and run for office, smaller offices along the way. And choosing to, working at the White House, getting to the White House, and then choosing to leave is what I would call a stumble, an unexpected moment for sure, a curveball. One that I'm immensely grateful for, but a definite curveball. I had sort of planned my whole life around that, and then got to that mountain and realized this is not the mountain that I want.
Right. And you were literally working in the White House. At one point, you were working for the First Lady of the USA, George W. Bush's wife, Laura Bush. I mean,
that's right. Yeah. I was working in the now destroyed East Wing, unfortunately.
How was it? What will you miss about the East Wing? What will we never see now that you liked about it?
Well, my hope is that hopefully they preserve some of the history. But what was special about the East Wing was, that is or was, the doors that Americans walked through on tours. It was the first thing you saw, other than security, the first thing you saw as a tourist of the White House. And there's just something really unique about that, really special about that, literally the doors to the East Wing being opened wide. And I can remember before tours and really before tours seeing White House workers literally roll out the carpets for tourists so they wouldn't damage the floors, and so they had a comfortable place to walk. And then afterward, I can remember seeing those same workers with cans of paint dabbing up the walls where kids might have scraped their elbows along the way. And that is a special thing. And my hope is, and it seems like maybe that's the intent, that the new East Wing will be equally welcoming to Americans and people from all over the world.
So you had this kind of heartbreaking moment when you realized this thing that I've wanted all my life isn't the thing I want, at least not
Yeah.
the way things are looking. So how did you pick yourself up from that? I say I'm turning myself into Jonathan Block and doing. So how am I doing? These are the questions
you're doing a hell of a lot better than I do.
Not at all.
I should have you host the pod.
I'm just copying your questions. So how did you pick yourself up? What did you learn from that experience?
You're right. I mean, you're right. There was a little bit of heartbreak and a little bit of kind of deep sadness. So this is not what I hope. This is not. I'm not becoming the human that I hoped I would become. And if who I say I want to become is actually real, then maybe this is not the direction of American politics, and especially working in political communications will not shape me into the human I want to be. And so, yeah, there was an absolute sort of sense of sadness and loss. I remember I really did not know what I was going to do when I left the White House. I intentionally scheduled a couple things. I intentionally scheduled a week-long trip to the Caribbean with my dad, and then skydiving. And then after that, I didn't know. But I did that because I knew people would say, what are you going to do next? And I would say, oh, I'm going to go jump out of a plane. And then they'd have a laugh. And then they'd say, no, really, what are you going to do? And I'd say, oh, I'm going to go to the Caribbean. And then they'd maybe laugh. And then usually most people didn't ask a third time. But if they did, I'd have to say, I genuinely don't know what I'm going to do next. I thought for a time maybe I would go to earn a degree and become a counseling psychologist. I decided not to do that. I actually ended up working for John McCain and Sarah Palin after I left the White House on their failed 2008 presidential bid. And then really after that moment, realized I'm stick a fork in me. I'm done. I'm out. I'm going to business.
Right. So you kind of give politics a bit of a second chance then.
I did. Yeah, I did. I did. I did. Yes. I was detailed specifically to Sarah Palin after she was announced. And particularly in working for her, I began to get a sense of where American politics was headed. I think in many ways she sort of fomented some of the hyper-partisanship that we see now, at least on the right. The left has their own actors who I haven't worked for, but especially after working for her, I realized it just isn't compatible with the human I want to become.
John McCain was mentioned, I think, in the interview, which will be the next clip we'll be hearing from. And it strikes me as very much an outsider that he was the old school Republican and Sarah Palin was maybe the new guard, the pre-MAGA, I guess, the John the Baptist of the MAGA movement. And it's interesting, he was kind of gracious in defeat, whether you liked his politics or you didn't. He still seemed to believe in the system, which I'm sure most Americans would agree has huge flaws. But if you're playing that game and you lose the election, you admit defeat, which I think was raised in this next clip. Which, why don't you introduce us to who was this person you were speaking to?
So clip number 2 is an interview with Admiral Mark Harnitchek, who was a client of mine after I left government and went into the private sector. My first clients were in the Department of Defense, which seemed sort of fitting given what I had done before going into business. And Admiral Harnitchek at the time was when I worked for him, he was the head of an organization called the Transportation Command inside the Department of Defense. But he went on to become the head of all logistics for the Department of Defense, leading a $45 billion budget and something like 40,000 people. So a massive enterprise. And when I worked for him and when I interviewed him, the man spent the first many years of his career on a submarine. So I think he might admit that his go-to wasn't necessarily soft skills. But when I worked for him, what I found was a man who had exceptionally high standards, but also deeply cared about his people and had intentionally cultivated soft skills, which is somewhat unusual for a 3-star Navy admiral. They're not known for being, tough and tender. They're known just for being tough, right? And what I mean by that is that what he speaks about in the podcast interview that I did with him is that he grew up under admirals who had likely served potentially in the Korean or in the Vietnam conflict and in the Korean conflict before that, and he talked about a couple of them who deeply changed him. And what he said was, he called them humorless, and that they the only positive reinforcement that you got was the lack of negative reinforcement and maybe more work, right? And also anger. He talked about how one of the admirals he worked for always had anger simmering under the surface. And when he was a young officer, he didn't want to become like that. But then as he grew in his career, he realized he was becoming like they were, with anger always under the surface. And he said he kind of had an aha moment where he realized, I'm having too much fun to be angry. I'm leading too great a team to be angry at them all the time. And also leadership is a mirror, and I will get back from them what I give them. And so I'm not going to be angry anymore. And amazing man.
Right, let's hear the clip then. This is on your podcast, Admiral Mark Harnitchek.
What I found was I was becoming like them. Short fuse, raising my voice. And I just had an epiphany sometime that I'm having too much fun to ever get angry, or impatient. Now that doesn't mean that you can't have high standards and be very demanding.
Yeah.
But if you're a leader of a big, well, any organization, frankly, but especially a big one, you have to look like you're having fun.
That was Admiral Mark Harnitchek speaking to Jonathan Block on Stumbling Blocks. There was another admiral I heard you speaking to who, and this was a great opening to an episode, you said the man you're about to hear has saved the lives of 12 million people. That's a remarkable story. Just tell us a little bit about that episode.
Yeah, this is really something that all Americans and really all people in the world whose governments contribute to foreign assistance can be immensely proud of. That admiral was Admiral Tim Ziemer, and he led what was called the President's Malaria Initiative, which is something that President George W. Bush started, but was continued by Presidents Obama, Biden, and Trump in his first term. And it was an effort to combat essentially childhood malaria across the globe. What those presidents realized was fundamentally there are several 100,000 cases a year of malaria, and tens of thousands of kids, hundreds of thousands of kids actually die globally of malaria. And that's a moral travesty, but it's also a national security risk, because people whose kids are dying of a disease that is immensely curable, historically, can pose security threats to the nations around them because they want their kids to thrive and survive. And so this initiative was a pretty simple effort to provide bed nets, to provide paint that kills mosquitoes, and some other pretty simple tools to help nations with the kind of mosquito that spreads malaria combat that disease. And Admiral Ziemer, through the work that he led, that American taxpayers spearheaded the funding for, ended up saving over 16 years, 12 million kids who would have otherwise died of malaria.
Hello, and welcome to The Stumble. Since this is President's Day week, I've invited a man who served 3 presidents and saved 12 million lives while carrying out the mission they gave him. He is Admiral Tim Ziemer. He spent 3 decades in the Navy, and then when the president came calling, he left a comfortable retirement to launch and lead the President's Malaria Initiative. It's an effort that every American can be proud of, regardless of party, because it saved more than 12 million people, mostly kids, from dying because of malaria and helped prevent another 2 billion cases. Admiral Ziemer's service to country and the world is bookended, though, by deep personal tragedy.
Why have you interviewed a couple of admirals? This is because of what you've done in your kind of day job, right?
Yeah, I happen to just have known those 2 admirals. And so I asked them if they would be guests. So those were just kind of happenstance. But I also find that the leadership brass in America's military, especially once they've retired and they're able to speak a bit more freely about their experience, what our military and humanitarian functions has done over the last 50 years is just nothing short of extraordinary. And there are stories that every American can be proud of, regardless of what side of the aisle you might sit on or maybe you used to sit on. the way that we have projected strength through peace is remarkable, and there are stories worth telling.
You mentioned Trump's first presidency and his second presidency. He's dismantled overseas development aid, and I understand if you don't want to get political here,
that's fine.
But George W. Bush will be remembered for a lot of not great things. I'm British, so it would have been Tony Blair here. Tony Blair actually, I think, did lots of good things, but history has shown, and many of us thought at the time, the invasion of Iraq was foolish and wrong for many reasons. And I think both of them, that will be a big legacy. For George W. Bush, the good legacy, was the work he did on AIDS in Africa, the work he did on malaria, slightly less well known, I would think, but that you talk a lot about in that episode. Presidents of the United States, and I guess prime ministers of the UK, and any of these big world leaders, they are concerned about their legacy, aren't they? And again, coming back to that question you ask, how do you want to be remembered, Jonathan? This is a question you ask at the end. Donald Trump's got he's got 3 years left to play, but at the moment, one of his legacies might be just dismantling all that good work from previous presidents, and maybe he did it because it was previous presidents, because if he didn't do it, he's not that keen on it. I don't know. Do you have a view that you'd like to express on what's going on in that area now?
Yeah, I'm happy to opine on it. What I won't opine on is why he's doing it, because I'm not in the room with him, and I don't think it's not fair for me to sort of attribute my opinion as to his motivation. But what I can say, sort of just from a historical perspective, is that, as you said, the humanitarian efforts that the United States and the UN and allied nations like Britain have undertaken really since the post-World War II era, and post-World War I even to some degree, have created an environment of economic growth that is unparalleled in human history. Period. Right? Especially if you think about sort of Europe post-World War I and post-World War II. And then some of the economic development that's happened elsewhere since then. As we look at malaria, 12 million lives saved. As we look at PEPFAR has saved 25 million people. PEPFAR is a President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It's that the global effort to fight AIDS on the continent of Africa. These are staggering numbers. 12 million people saved from malaria, 25 million people saved from HIV/AIDS. And in dismantling them, I think there are two cautions. The first is, of course, just the moral question we have to ask ourselves, and something that President Bush often said when I worked for him was, "To whom much is given, much is required." I happen to believe that's true, and so I do think that at the end of, as we think about our legacy as a country and individually, the question of what we did with our tremendous wealth and what we did with our extraordinary technology and our advances in medicine will be asked of us. And it will be something that we want to tell our kids and the generations to come what we did for good with the wealth that we have been lucky enough to build and to inherit. So that's sort of question, the first. And then the second is that, again, across history, we see that nations and peoples who face epidemics and famines and know that their neighbors can help them and their neighbors did nothing, historically, it does not bode well. It does not bode well for those neighbors who did nothing.
This question of legacy, as I've mentioned a couple of times, you make it a point of it being your last question, or towards your last question. How do you want to be remembered? Why did you strike upon that as a question?
I think, so again, as I've worked with leaders over the decades, it's the leaders who know the answer to that question very clearly and succinctly who are most successful in terms of business. And I think a lot of times in business, it's so easy to focus on quarterly results, right? Or what the street is saying, or on share price, or on any number of distractions. And they're not distractions, they're important things. I shouldn't call them distractions, but on any number of, I'll call them brush fires. But it's the leaders who know how to answer that question, what do I want to be known for? What values guide my decision making? Who make it through the quarters when numbers don't look great? Because they have their eye on a North Star. And the leaders who can't answer that question clearly and succinctly oftentimes get capsized by the quarter where numbers don't work out so well. And so that's why I ask, because I'm curious to see, can you answer the question? And if so, what is your answer?
Well, let's hear, talking of business, let's hear from a businessman now. This is our third and final clip from Stumbling Blocks. Tell us about Brent Beshore.
So Brent is the CEO of a private equity company here in the United States called Permanent Equity. And if you're familiar with the private equity model in the US, you know that permanency is not a word that is used frequently, right? Generally speaking, private equity firms here, buy for 3 to 5 years and then exit after they have sort of wrung the company that they purchased, wrung it dry, which is a harsh term, but true in many cases. And Brent's company is really different. Brent invests with an intentionally long time horizon. 27 years is his typical time horizon. And he invests to be, he, as he calls it, a good steward of companies while he owns them, and a responsible steward to the employees who work there, and a responsible steward to the investors who pooled their money with his to help him buy companies. It's just a very different way of speaking about companies, about private equity, that you just don't hear often in the States and really anywhere. And so I asked Brent, if you read his quarterly, his annual letter to shareholders, which I commend to everyone, they're shocking. They talk, of course, about business outcomes, and his business outcomes are remarkable. The company's doing great. It's blown the doors off. But he also talks about some of these things that you and I have just talked about values and earning trust, and some of these concepts that sometimes have been a bit lost in the shuffle in American business. And so I asked him about that, and kind of, especially if you look about 10 years ago, there's a bit of a shift in his annual letters. And one of the things he talks about is that he says, Jonathan, or he says in his letters, about 10 years ago, for a long time, we tried to be someone we weren't. We tried to act like the East Coast private equity firms, and we tried to sort of cover up the fact that none of us have Ivy League degrees. And that just didn't work. And then writing about 10 years ago, he says, we made a switch, and we just decided to be who we are, which is that we're a Midwestern American private equity firm, and we invest for 27 years, and none of us went to Ivy League schools. And in doing so, we kind of unlocked something in ourselves and in the market.
I mean, I think that the greatest freedom that we can have is just to be authentically who we are. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be molded and shaped into something better. That's not like a very modern idea of just be you, right? Be more you. Like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, God gave us a design. We have a tendency to be herd animals, right? Like, we like to be homogenized into the safety of the herd. And what it results in is we all listen to the same things and do the same things and say the same things and watch the same things. And I think that some of that is shared culture and commonality and community results in that. And I think that can be really powerful. But I think that a lot of my life, I was trying to pretend to be the things that I thought other people wanted me to be. And so I was constantly scanning the room saying, okay, who is that person? What do they like? How do I need to adjust myself to be them? And it's exhausting. It's a form of codependence. It's a form of hiding. And you're constantly trying to adjust and maneuver and manipulate in many ways.
Yeah.
And so, as I get older, it's like, man, I just want people I want to be, and I want people to be true. I just want the truth.
The truth is, all of us have these things that are hard to explain, or that don't quite make sense, or don't tell the story that we think we should tell. And I'll just tell you, I'm the son of a Jewish father and a Quaker mother. I grew up between two cornfields, although they did not. They grew up in cities, Boston for my mom and St. Louis for my dad, and they decided they wanted to raise their kids in the country, and so they raised us in the country between two cornfields. And because I'm Quaker on one side and Jewish on the other, I use Old English at home, like Hamlet, but I'm also Jewish, and so like at Passover, which is coming up here just in about a week. I might say to my wife or to my family, hey, will thee pass the matzah? Or is that stack of matzah thine? Right? So it's this crazy combination of cultures and even linguistics. And I've been sort of reticent to talk about it because I didn't know how to talk about it. And what Brent says, and what was so helpful to me about that conversation with him is just be who you are and just talk about it and let it sort of settle out in the wash, and it'll be okay. You don't need to worry about how other people perceive it.
But when you were growing up, were your parents or your father at least using Old English expressions like that?
Oh, yeah.
Is that, yeah, okay.
Yeah. We still do. Yeah, if I were to go inside right now, from my home office just to go to where the kids are, I would speak in Old English to them. Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting.
Which is a Quaker thing from,
okay. I've never come across that. I mean, the closest thing I can relate it to would be, maybe in Scotland, people talk about, the wee lad, or, little bits of dialect would come in, which obviously would be, from time immemorial, and that haven't yet been kind of washed out of modern English. But I haven't really come across that kind of Old English. Oh, good. I mean, it's funny you say about being yourself, and you present a podcast, and it's interesting because there's always an element of performance, isn't there? I'm talking to you now, slightly different, probably if we were literally in the same room and we weren't recording this. It would be mostly the same. Yeah. But I am aware other people are listening to it. I hope they are, and also the way you speak. I don't use Old English. I grew up with, but I grew up with a. I don't think I do. I grew up with a fairly pronounced regional accent, which over the years I've lost. Yeah. I sound British to you. I know that, but I would have had a regional accent from the Midlands of England, and I'm sure if I still lived there, I'd still have that accent. Would I? Do I put on a voice to be on a podcast? I don't know anymore. I've been doing this for 6 years now. I don't know anymore. Do you find that? Do you find yourself performing on microphone?
I really try not to, and less and less. I think my first few podcasts, I was terribly nervous, and I was really struggling for my place. I had just hit a stumbling block. I was part of mass layoffs at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, at the tail end of 2024, and was kind of nervous and a little bit ashamed of that. And so I think if you listen to my first few pods, that comes through. But over time, I try to be just me. Just the same person that I am, that you see publicly and privately and personally are sort of aligned. They're all the same Jonathan. And that is helpful to me just as a human. It helps me go to sleep at night and sleep well, knowing that I've represented myself to myself and to my family and then to the world as the same person. But also, I think, Robin, in the age of AI, and I know you've had a lot of discussions on AI in your other podcasts, in the age of AI where anybody can create a perfect podcast using Notebook LLM, or anybody can create a perfect picture or a perfect video, people are actually hungry for the chinks in the armor. They're hungry for imperfections and the faults and foibles that make us human and make us unique from the robots.
And that's what your podcast's all about, right? That is the faults and the foibles. I mean, that's AI, if you were to interview an AI about, which you could, of course, very easily. Of course, I think I have done. It wasn't very interesting. You could say what were your stumbling blocks and how did you learn, and it could make something up, but it wouldn't really have that human experience. I think that's why I would recommend your podcast to people, because yes, it's got, news you can use, right? It's got that kind of, here's how to apologize, or here's how to learn this thing. But it's also just got that. This is a human experience. Those are the most interesting things. Yeah. How did you recover from this thing? Why did you realize you were going up the wrong mountain? These are the questions you ask people.
My guest on my podcast that will drop later today, Attorney General Gonzalez, and I think by the time this podcast airs, listeners will be able to find it. He resigned from his role as Attorney General under what was then considered a bit of a scandal. Now it wouldn't even register, but back then it was, 2007. And he didn't find his next really serious role for 5 years. And I share that because I think there are so many Americans right now who are in similar positions where their role has been subsumed by AI or by budget cuts or Doge or what have you. And they're really struggling to find what's next. What does meaning look like in a world where a robot can do my job 10 times better and 10 times faster than I did? And I worked for 20 years to develop that craft. And so these are the stories that we want to hear because they help us figure out life. And robots can't do that yet.
Right. So, what do you listen to? I've asked you to bring me a couple of recommendations. I asked you, there's someone else I'll be interviewing and who didn't get the question. I said to bring one that would be fun. And I think I used the expression with you, bring one that's eat your greens. Did I say that to you?
You did, yes.
And eat your, and she said, what on earth do you mean eat your greens? I said, what I meant was a nourishing one that you listen because it will make you a better, cleverer, smarter person or something like that. These are early days on the Pick of the Pods podcast. I might change my question, but for the moment, but you did, you stuck to the script and you brought us an eat your greens and a fun one. So give us whichever one you want to start with.
I did. I'll start with the Eat Your Greens one. It's the Carey Nieuwhof podcast. And he did an interview with Prof G. And I love the way that Prof G talks about how we have failed young men and what we can do about it, because there's a trend that I see right in my own neighborhood. I think young men are really struggling in a world, again, that we've just talked about, where AI plus so much more. And I think we've done, in many senses, a real disservice to them. And I think what Prof G is saying is spot on. And then after I emailed you that, you hosted Prof G as best I could.
I did. Oh, so it was after.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you picked this because I'd interviewed Prof G.
Yeah.
Is Scott Galloway. Scott Galloway. He's lots of things. In fact, I had difficulty introducing him onto my other podcast. He's known to me as a podcaster because he presents the Prof G pod and he co-presents Pivot with Kara Swisher, both very interesting podcasts. He's a professor of marketing, I think is his day job, and he's also a private equity investor, right? A bit one of your other guests who we mentioned earlier. And we had him on because exactly of this issue. And it's actually a colleague of mine who suggested him to me, and who co-hosts that episode with me. If Scott Galloway happens to be there, can we get him in and talk to him? And it was very, very interesting. He's an interesting guy because he's a bit of a bro himself, at least in his personality. He's not, although he considers himself what the Americans would call liberal, what we might say left wing, he considers himself in that camp. He considers himself a feminist, which is quite unusual to hear a man call himself a feminist. And however, he has some opinions about gender roles and stuff that wind quite a lot of feminists up the wrong way. And several people have said to me, why are you talking to this guy? And my answer was, I think it's very interesting. And the issue of masculinity, of boyhood, the manosphere, all that stuff. I've done a number of Pick of the Pods related to that. I did one just last week, which was about Louis Theroux's documentary on Netflix. Very interesting. It wasn't the Louis Theroux podcast. He was on someone else's podcast, but you can find that on Pick of the Pods. It's just it's a really crucial subject, and not just for men, but for everyone else as well. Just like the position of women is an issue not just for women, it's an issue for men as well. These things are absolutely, you can't separate them. And so, I thought it was really interesting. Tell me about this podcast, because I'm not familiar with Carey Nieuwhof. Who's Carey Nieuwhof?
Carey Nieuwhof is a podcaster, an author. He's a pastor of a very large church, but his podcast is really speaking to people like Prof G and other folks sort of in the leadership space. So CEOs, former government officials, former military officials, many of the same maybe folks that you might interview or I might interview, but specifically the angle of helping the listener very practically become a better leader.
You mentioned he's a pastor, so it's religion. On a number of your podcasts, religion comes up. it's interesting to listen to. I'm just wondering, is that something you've deliberately sought out, or why does religion come up so often?
It is not something I've sought out. It's actually been kind of surprising to me. It is not something I've sought out at all. I just ask people fairly intrusive questions about their life and their motivations. And for some folks, religion is such an important part of who they are that that comes out in the wash. It comes out in their answers, but it's not something that I've intentionally kind of cultivated. And it's been an interesting byproduct of asking people probing questions about what drives them.
Right. I haven't listened to that one yet, but I will do, because I'd be interested in hearing what Scott Galloway says about it. He did mention briefly in my conversation with him how the erosion of church as or any religious place as a community is one of the factors that has created this kind of crisis of masculinity. Interesting. I think America is slightly different from Western Europe when it comes to religion, but always worth listening to, I think, those conversations.
Yeah, and Prof G, so this podcast, I mean, Prof G is a self-professed agnostic. And so the podcast, this particular one that I'm thinking of, is not really at all religious. And the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast isn't particularly religious either. He happens to be a religious minister in his day job, but the podcast itself is really just focused on leadership and what makes leaders tick and what we can learn from them.
So that was your Eat Your Greens one. We'll all feel better if we consume that one. What's your fun one that I allowed you?
So Heavyweight, and what I love is that the host of Heavyweight on many episodes, not all of them, but on many of them, he calls his sister and has some sort of non sequitur thing to tell her, and she usually laughs and then kind of hangs up on him or something like that, right? And it reminds me so much of my big sister, Kak, who is 4 years older than I am. She's a nurse practitioner, primary care provider in Texas, and she and I are very close, and she has an outrageous, wonderful laugh. And I do damn near anything to make her laugh, including things like I might call her to tell her that I got gas at a really good price. I might call her to tell her that, it's been a couple of days since she's called me, and I am disappointed that it's been a while. Most of her friends at work now know me, and they call me Johnny, which is what she calls me. And so I might call her to ask about her friends at work when she's at work, knowing that she's there. And so all in the pursuit of making her laugh. And she does, and it makes my day. And the calls are usually pretty brief. And but it's a great joy in my life, and I suspect it hers too.
And so this podcast, Heavyweight, reminds you a bit of that. It's interesting. We have these parasocial relationships with the people we listen to on podcasts. Right. And it's funny, actually, now I think of it, there are a couple of people I love to listen to who do remind me of friends of mine. Like just a little bit, just that little, they might have said that little quip,
Right, exactly.
And it's people you like. And I guess and it's a very subjective thing. You'll listen to those people. Some people won't. I think particularly when it comes to humor and that kind of co-host banter stuff, there's things I just can't. I've had lots of podcasts recommended to me. I've not listened to Heavyweight yet, so I don't know whether it will chime with me or not. But I've had quite a few, because I'm always asking people, because I do Pick of the Pods every week.
Sure,
I have a churn of stuff. So please, I'm desperate for recommendations. And so many people have said, "Oh, you'll love these two guys. They're hilarious." I'm 2 minutes in, and I'm absolutely sick of them, But because it's so personal, But there are others that I love that other people might just find annoying.
Right.
I think we're coming to the end of the time I can probably keep you for, Jonathan. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions about what would be your dream podcast or your dream interview.
I think maybe three. So I'd love to interview John Meacham. His book for a long time was right behind me. Now it's been replaced by President George H.W. Bush's book and Michelle Obama's book. But his book,
it's beautifully balanced, your background, I have to say.
Oh, thank you. It's very intentional, as you can imagine.
Oh, I can see that. Yeah, exactly. Anyone listening to this, we've got two books behind Jonathan. One is The George Bush, is that the elder then? I can see
George
It's,
H.W. Bush, that's right.
Yeah, on one side, Michelle Obama on the other. So yeah, you've got all bases covered, almost all bases covered. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go on.
No, you're fine. But John Meacham's book on Congressman John Lewis, called Across That Bridge, it was life-changing, especially in the way that he detailed the bravery of John Lewis and the Freedom Riders, who knew that they would probably be either severely injured or killed when they walked across the bridge at Selma and did so many other heroic things, but did it anyway because they thought it was the right thing to do.
So this is during the civil rights movement,
civil rights era
in the States.
Yeah, exactly. But so John Meacham is one. He's written so many other amazing tomes, including one on President George H.W. Bush. So that's one. The second is my dad. He spent his life devoted to helping kids from hard places be placed into permanent loving families, and had the chance to impact more than 2,500 kids across his career and be placed into permanent loving adoptive families. And then the third is, I think I'm going to go with President George W. Bush.
Okay. You'll probably get them on. Is your dad still with us?
He is, yeah.
Well, there you are. That should be an easy booking.
I think that will be, yes.
Right. The other two, I don't know. Worth a try, right?
Worth a try. You got it.
Definitely. Okay, let's wind up. Tell people where people can find your podcast.
They can find it anywhere they listen to their favorite podcasts, and it's simply Stumbling Blocks: How Great Leaders Are Made with Jonathan Block. Thanks very much, Jonathan. For a weekly podcast recommendation, if you're listening to this, you can subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Look for Pick of the Pods. You'll get a weekly pick direct in your email inbox. And follow this podcast, Pick of the Pods, wherever you get podcasts. Pick of the Pods is a Spinny Hill podcast. It was written and presented by me, Robin Pomeroy. Music is by Far. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a rating on your podcast app and tell your friends they might want to listen to. For now, from me, thanks to you for listening, thanks to Jonathan, and goodbye.